Hello and welcome to the webcast. My name is Steven Roselle. I'm a Senior Solutions Specialist with Autodesk, focusing primarily on Maya, but also Motion Builder and Mudbox. If you're interested in the kinds of things that I'm talking about today, you can definitely check out my blog where I've got a lot more information. If you want to go to the area, it's actually area.autodesk.com/blogs/StevenR, and on my blog, I basically cover a wide range of Maya-specific topics. So I'll post this link up again later. So let's begin with modeling. Now what you'll see here is a character. This character was actually provided to us by our friends at Eidos Montreal from their game Deus Ex Human Revolution. This is the hero character from that game. And as you can see, I'm seeing kind of a crude kind of display of this character. Now in the game itself, the character is much richer. There are many more details in the textures, the lighting is better, and so on. So what I want to do actually is see that same kind of quality in the Maya viewport. So I'm going to switch over into viewport 2.0. As soon as I do, and as soon as I turn on my lights as well, you'll notice a lot more detail in the textures, including things like normal maps, specular maps, and in addition to that, CGFX shaders, which I'll talk about in a bit. As well as a significant performance improvement. So previously in 2011 when this was released, it was basically a display and layout tool. So I could basically assemble objects within a scene, but I couldn't really do any lower level modeling or animation. So new in Maya 2011, we now have the ability to go in and work directly on our meshes with all of our modeling tools directly in viewport 2.0. So it becomes a full-on modeling and animation viewport. Again, that's new in 2012. So let's pull in here and we'll talk about one of the newer specific features. I'm going to go into the new interactive split tool. And what this tool allows you to do is basically preview the split of your polygon object. So it replaces the old split tool, and it basically allows us to essentially click on various points, whether they're existing vertices or midpoints of an edge, spanning across existing edges and or faces, and then ultimately ending at the desired location, and we get a preview of what that's going to look like. Then we hit enter and it will actually create that detail. So to give you an idea of the problems that this new tool solves, let's take a look at the back here and take a look at this texture area. Let's say I wanted to create an edge that followed that. Now this would be very cumbersome using the old split tool. Now I can just go in with a new split tool and begin plotting down my points right in the middle of my object, independent of any existing edges and or vertices. So you can see I started on a face, and or rather an arbitrary point on a face, and then I ended back at the same point, never having clicked on an edge or a vertice. When I hit enter, it'll automatically insert that. So I'd obviously need to clean this up a bit, but for time's sake, I'm going to move on and talk about a couple of other new tools. So let's talk about the gun here. Let's actually quickly introduce something called bonus tools. Bonus tools is a suite of modeling, animation, and rendering tools that basically is an add-on to Maya. You can download this on the area. So if you just do a search for bonus tools on the area, you'll find the installer for this, and it basically provides you a whole suite of tools for doing a variety of things. Now this is the biggest kind of update to bonus tools that we've seen in a long time. Basically the entire menu set has been reorganized to match the existing Maya menu. So we have our edit, modify, create, display, and so on. We have our animation, modeling, UV editing, and so on. And all the tools have been organized accordingly, plus we've added quite a few new tools. So I'm going to use a new tool under here, under my modify tool, for saving a transform. I'm going to store the transform values of this gun object. So we basically can go in and we can name the button that we want to create, select the object, and I'll just simply say store selected. Now that will create a stored setting for this gun. So now I can basically pick that up, I can move it around, I can rotate it, whatever I want to do, and then just click that button, it'll pop it right back into place. That's just one simple example. There are a whole slew of tools, which I'll be talking about in future blog posts, so if you want to follow my blog, I'll actually go into detail about a lot more of these tools. But for now, let's go in and we'll actually just put this gun down at the origin. And I'm going to focus in on this and hide the body. And actually, let's just hide the environment as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a new tool set for creating polygon detail with curves. So what you'll see here is a NURBS curve. This is actually just a circle. It could be manually created, or it could be a linear line, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to take that, I'm going to project that onto my gun to create a hole here for the thumb. So basically I have the trigger handle here, and then I have a bracing handle here where I need to have a thumb for the thumb grip here, a hole for the thumb grip. So basically what I want to do is take the curve and the mesh, and I'll go into my new tool called Project Curve on Mesh. And in Project Curve on Mesh, I just simply want to choose the axis I want to project. So I'm going to do YZ. I could also select the specific viewport if I wanted to. But I'll choose YZ, and I also want to project only onto the edges. So I could preserve as much of this curve detail as possible by default, but if I turn on Project to Edges Only, now when it projects the curve, it will only project it to the existing edges, so it won't create any of that extra detail that I don't need. Now I have a dynamic connection between this curve and the projected curve on my object. So I can go in here and I can actually change the shape of my curve as I'm projecting it. So this is dynamic, of course, as I mentioned, and of course it exists on both sides since I actually projected through. I actually have a curve all the way through the object, or rather one on each side. And then ultimately what I want to do is actually use this as a trimming mechanism for my gun. So I'm going to select both the curves and the gun, and then I'll just come down here under Split Mesh with Projected Curve, and I'm going to create a split and detach. So I'll apply my split and detach, and what that will do, if I just split it, would just insert the edges. But with a split and detach, what that will do is it will actually create edges that basically exist where the curve was before. So now I can double click on this, and you can see that it actually not only created the edges, but it created a cut so that I can actually extract or delete those shells. So I've got one on each side. If I double click here, I can isolate that. So those are just shells within the object. I'm just going to go in and grab those and just delete them. So you could use this as a way of going in and carving up an object for something like a shatter effect, or you can use it for cutting holes or cutting out sections of a piece of geometry. So I'm going to go in here and grab a couple of edge loops, and then we'll just quickly zip this up. I'm going to go into my Merge Edge tool, just make sure my threshold is up a bit. There it is. And bam, now I've got a nice clean hole cut into my object, or my gun, based on the projection of a curve. So you can probably imagine all the different things that you can do with this. If you've ever worked with NURBS, it's very similar to a NURBS trimming workflow. So one other thing I want to do while I'm in here is actually extend a piece of this gun body and basically create what appears to be like a trigger right here. So you can see here I've got this little mechanism here that has kind of an anchor point here. It looks to be like a trigger for a grenade launcher or something like that, but it's very small, so I want to extend that. So I'm going to go in and just grab these faces, and I'm going to apply an extrude. Let me just first reset my options here. And if I just applied an extrude, what that would do is it would just extrude out along the normal of the object. But what I want to do is I want to create a curve, a default curve that automatically gets built and linked to the extrusion. So I'm going to choose Generated Curve. That's a new option. Now that will extrude that, and you'll notice a few things. One is now I have the ability, of course, to work with my standard manipulators, as always, but I also have these extra manipulators, which are essentially sliders that allow me to control things like the number of divisions. So I can interactively go in and dial up the number of divisions. I can interactively go in and dial up something like the thickness, or I could go in and I could key in a specific value. If I just select one of these values, I can actually enter that directly. So I'm going to actually undo that because that's a little bit much. But you get the basic idea there. Very handy, quick way of editing some of our extrude parameters. But what I really want to show down here is, or in here, is a curve that was built based on, whoops, let's go into object mode there, is a curve that was actually built based on the default, the average normal of those faces. And if I actually go into the control points of this curve, you can see that I can begin to edit these control points and actually change the look of the extrusion. So there I can actually add a bend to it. So I'm going to undo that a couple of times. And I'm actually going to turn on my soft select this time. So I'll just hit my B hotkey and I'll just dial up the soft select so I can get a nice soft fall off over that curve. That's probably a little bit much. Let's dial that down there. And now I'll just quickly go in here and add a little bit of a rotate to that. So I'll switch over to my world rotate and I'll turn on my textures while I do this. So there you can see I can actually just kind of pick that up and pull it down and then just add a little bit of rotate here. That's probably a little bit much. Let's kind of pull it up there. And now really quickly I've added a nice little arc or angle to that extrude. Now one other thing I might want to do just to clean this up visually is actually go into the extrude node and just add a bit of a taper. So there's actually a taper attribute that goes along with this curve, so I can actually kind of taper that out to a point. And now really quickly I was able to get the desired shape. So again, the ability to create that curve automatically is actually new and much improved as far as the workflow goes. So let's talk a bit more about Viewport 2.0. I've already mentioned some of the changes in Viewport 2.0 as far as modeling and animation, but what you'll notice here is that I have, again, a character from Deus Ex Human Revolution, and as I begin to pull into this character, you'll notice a significant amount of detail in the texture and shader of this character. And as I pull into the face, you'll notice really fine details in the pockmarks and the scars, and even down to the pores of the character's face. Now, this is a combination of texture maps, specular maps, or diffuse, normal maps, and so on, and they're all composited in with the CGFX shader with various CGFX shader controls. So we've supported CGFX shaders for a while in the standard Maya viewport, as you can see, but in this release we've done a couple of things. One is we've completely rewritten the CGFX shader, so it's a more robust implementation of the shader itself, but we've also integrated it into viewport 2.0. And as a benefit, we now have significant performance improvements. So if I play this back, I'm going to play back a simple animation. If you'll watch the little frame rate counter right here in the lower right, I'm getting anywhere between 30 to 40, max 40, but roughly around 35 frames a second, I would say, on average. So again, this is in the standard Maya viewport. Now what you'll notice is as soon as I turn on viewport 2.0 and I play this back, now notice the frame rate is jumping up anywhere between 40 to now 60, up to 69. I even saw an 80 in there somewhere. But let's just say I'm averaging around 60 frames a second, 55 to 60 frames a second. So just by turning on viewport 2.0 with, I'd say I've got about 10 CGFX shaders, I'm noticing somewhere in the range of a 60% performance improvement. So that alone is worthwhile. So in addition to performance improvements, the inclusion of the various modeling and animation manipulators, as well as the integration of CGFX shaders in viewport 2.0, we've also added quite a bit as far as visual quality and as far as controlling the visual look of your entire viewport. So what you'll see here is just kind of a Maya environment. This is using the standard Maya viewport, and as you can see, I get a kind of crude representation of the textures and shaders. Now as soon as I go in and I turn on viewport 2.0, you'll notice that I see significant improvement in the visual quality. Now if I go in and I turn on my lights, now you'll see that I have significant improvement beyond that, and if I scrub the timeline, you can actually see there that I have animated lights. So I have real-time lighting with soft depth map shadows. If I pull into the scene here a little bit, you can see that I've got quite a bit of detail going on in the viewport. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other changes that we can make to the look of the viewport itself. So the one thing I notice here is that the viewport itself is kind of dark. So I'm going to actually open the parameters or the attributes of the viewport renderer, the viewport 2.0 renderer. The first thing I want to do is actually come in here and grab my gamma and turn on my gamma correct. Now if I grab this slider, I can begin to dial that up to increase the gamma of my scene. So of course, if I was working with a CGFX shader, I could do this on a per shader basis, but this is essentially allowing me to correct it on the entire viewport. Now I can also go in and I can change things like my anti-aliasing. So you can see these little jaggies here. It may be a little difficult to see because of the screen recording software, but you can see jaggies in my scene. As soon as I turn on my anti-aliasing, what that will do is it will immediately smooth out those jaggies and give me a nice clean line wherever I have those kind of high contrast areas. Now beyond that, I also have the ability to go in and turn on things like anti-aliasing, or sorry, things like ambient occlusion. That's what I was trying to say. If I turn on ambient occlusion, what you'll notice is that the cracks and crevices, for instance here between these buildings and here around the edges of my bike, as I begin to dial up the anti-aliasing, sorry, did it again, the ambient occlusion effect, you can actually clearly see how that kind of enriches the quality of the viewport. So I'm going to dial that up pretty high, and again, all this is interactive, so I can go in and I can move the camera around at any point. Speaking of cameras, I can also do per camera adjustments as well in the viewport. So let's select the camera itself, and let's go down into the depth of field setting. Now I'm going to turn that on, and what you'll see as soon as I turn on the depth of field, everything in the foreground blurs. And this one little building here in the background is actually nice and crisp and clean. So that's basically because of the focal distance, the depth essentially of the focus. So all I have to do is go in and just grab this parameter and begin to dial that down, and I can start to change the focal point to the appropriate location. So I'm actually going to target right about there. It's going to bring the character kind of into focus. It's actually, whoops, pull back a little bit. Let's actually bring the character out from the bike a little bit. There you can see the character's kind of coming into focus right there. I just need to change my f-stop value because it's a little low. I'll dial the f-stop up a little bit, and now you can see I've kind of made the character nice and crisp, and then the areas in the background, like the building and like this fighter thing, whatever it is actually blurred. So now let's talk about the various animation tools that were either added or enhanced in Maya 2012. And we'll start with Human IK. So actually, just for the simplicity of the web cast, I'm actually just going to hide the background here. And we'll just try to keep the the viewport kind of simple so you can see what's going on. So I'm going to go into my characterization tool, and actually a little preface on this. HIK was actually integrated and added into Maya in version 2011 as kind of a first pass on the implementation. And since then, in Maya 2012, we have taken it a step farther, and we've actually kind of unified the workflow between Maya and Motion Builder. HIK actually is a toolset that came over from Motion Builder originally. So now we have the same solver between the two applications, and we've also unified the UI and the basic workflow for setting up HIK. So that includes the characterization tool. The characterization tool is basically for kind of defining your character. So what it does is it gives you kind of a visual view of what your character will look like, a humanoid of course. And then I just simply double click on the joint in my graphical display here, and then I just click and map that to a joint in my viewport, in my scene. So I can grab the hips, for instance, and then just swipe over the hips, and now it's made that association. So I can keep doing this on all the various joints, or if I want to, I can actually import in a template. And a template basically is an XML file that basically describes the joint naming conventions. So I can use something like the default HIK, I can use something like cat from 3ds Max, or I can use something like biped from 3ds Max. So let's actually go in and browse for a custom file, and by doing this, I am basically able to load in a file that maybe is associated with the specific naming conventions for my characters that is based on my joint exports, or rather my game export. So I'm going to load in the IDOS template here, and you'll see when I do that, it will actually go in and it'll make all the necessary matches for my character. So anything that's green indicates that it has indeed made the match. Anything that is this kind of orange color indicates that there might be a problem. I also have this yield sign up here which warns me that something's wrong. So if I scroll down, it'll actually tell me in the dialog box what's wrong, and it's essentially saying that my arms and my hands are not aligned correctly. So for HIK to really work well, we have to actually go in and create what's called a T-pose. That's basically positioning our character into a T-stance so that the rig will work more appropriately. So now you can see that as I interactively rotated that, it updated with a green light, basically indicating that everything is good to go. So now I can lock that in, and then I can go in and I can create the control rig. So when I create the control rig, what that will do is it will give me an FK-IK rig system. Now in order to work with this, I have another interface called the character controls. This is also unified with Motion Builder. And it basically gives me a graphical view, or rather a kind of a diagram essentially of my rig. Allows me to select things like FK joints directly from this interface. So I can go in and I can select and rotate an FK joint right there. I'm actually going to hide the FK just for visual kind of simplicity. And we'll just go in and we'll begin to work with our character. And you can see if I right click on any part of my character, it brings up marking menus which are unique to HIK. Now this is actually new in 2012. One thing to point out is that previously we had something called the FBIK rig. That was the early implementation of this solver, and that has since been removed, and now the workflow between FBIK and Human IK has been kind of merged essentially. So these marking menus came over from FBIK. So I'm going to switch over into body part mode, and you can see now I basically have a limited range of motion based on just the IK of the arm. Now if instead I come in here and I switch over into full body mode, just with my marking menus, now I have basically a full range of motion of the entire body. So for instance, I can actually come in here and I can grab the hand, I can pull that forward, and then I can pull it across the body, and you can see the body will actually turn and face the hand. So the entire body kind of understands everything else. Another thing I can do is I can right click and just swipe up to go to the stance pose, which is really handy. So I'm actually going to put my character into just a really simple pose, and we'll talk about keyframing. So the keyframing workflow has been updated to work with these body part and full body modes, basically the marking menus. So what I want to do is simply switch into full body mode, and I'm going to set a key right now. So I'll set a key, and that will key everything in the entire rig. Now I'll just scrub ahead to frame, let's say 100. Actually, let's just set my boundary to be 100. And now I'll just begin to pose my character. So I'll grab him and I'll grab his arm and kind of pull that forward as though he's reaching for something. Also want to have him kind of lean down and actually look at whatever it is he's kind of reaching for, something like that. I'll take this arm over here and I'll just kind of counterbalance that. And then I might want to go in and use my graphical view here to grab the FK and then rotate that arm into place. Then I'll go in and I'll grab the foot and I'll basically begin to position that, and I'm just going to kind of have him step out towards whatever it is he's trying to reach. Let's actually pull that out a little bit further. And then because I'm in full body mode, all I have to do is just hit the S key, and that will keyframe everything in the entire rig. So now I've keyframed IK and FK and pretty much anything associated with the rig. And what I can also do is keyframe just based on the body part. So let's say right here in the middle of that side step, I want to have him raise his foot. I'm going to switch over now into body part mode, and you can see there that by doing that, now I've limited the influence of that leg. So I'm actually just going to pull the leg up a little bit. I'll kind of rotate the foot around just so he's kind of stepping. You can see his knees bent in, so I'll just go in and grab the FK joint, and then I'll rotate that around. Again, it's usually easier to work with FK from this kind of graphical view over here. Now he's kind of stepping up. Again, I've got just a joint selected, but because I'm in body part mode, when I hit S, it's going to keyframe that body part. So now I've keyframed everything associated with the leg. So now you can see that he's kind of reaching down for something, and now his leg actually lifts off the ground and kind of turns in before it does the step. Now, of course, many of you may be aware that HIK is also a very powerful retargeting tool. So I've got keyframe animation on my character right now, but I could just as easily go in and bring in another character and transfer that animation from one character to another. So you can see that they actually have two unique animations. This is mocap here, this is a keyframe animation. I'm actually going to take that motion capture animation and I'm going to transfer it by making it a source or an input to my hero character. As soon as I do that, now wherever that skeleton animation goes, my hero character is going to follow. Now this is true independently of the size, so depending on the situation, for instance, if I were to go in and pick this character and maybe scale him down a little bit, what you'll see here is that it's actually going to change the relative kind of placement of his animation. So now you can actually see that because he's smaller, he's going to take a shorter step, or his gait is going to be shorter in general. He's going to cover less ground. But he's actually going to be in a different location because of that relative kind of change. Now what I can also do is I can go into my character settings. So for any character, I can go into the property of that character. And under my solver, I can actually go in and I can actually set this to what's called match source. And what that will do is it will ensure that our character is going to actually match the target points of my source character. And that's regardless of how big or small he is. So if I were to go in and select this character again and let's just say I wanted to scale him up to actually make him larger, now you'll see that he actually is a much larger character, but he's still going to follow the same steps as my source character. So there's a lot more to talk about on the retargeting front. For those of you that have used Motion Builder, we've also integrated auxiliary pivots and auxiliary effectors for creating secondary controls on your character. And you can also, of course, bake all of this down to the final character to actually have the keys exists on the character as opposed to having the live retarget. But for time's sake, I'm going to have to move on and talk about some of the other animation changes. One of my favorite new features in Maya 2012 is the addition of editable motion trails. So you can see here we have this animation of this hovercraft kind of hovering on the dock, and then it takes off and flies along a path. That's not actually created from a motion path. That's actually created from keyframes. So if I just select this object and I go into the graph editor, what you can see is just standard keyframes. Now I'm going to temporarily turn my tangents off just so we can visually see these keys, but you can see that these keyframes are actually creating that animation. So let me just dial this back a little bit and I'll scrub through my timeline, and you can see that right about there he's kind of reaching his high point of motion. So if I were to actually go in and grab a key in my graph editor, you can see that I can actually alter the path of that craft by just editing that key. Oftentimes it's a little bit hard to predict what's going to happen when you edit a 2D curve. So what we can do now is we can actually take our object here, or any object basically, and we can create an editable motion trail for that object. What this will do is it will give us a visual path for the keyframes that we were seeing before. So now you can see I have a trail before and a trail after with a bit of a delay. And at any point in here, I can go in and I can begin to edit keys on this. So let's just right click and I'll turn on my frame numbers. You can see there I have a frame number 339, which actually syncs up exactly to a frame number in my graph editor. So what you can see is if I begin to edit the path of this craft here, the bike craft, you can see that also dynamically goes in and changes the curve. So if I pull this out a little bit so he goes more vertically, you can see that that's interactively adjusting the curves as I do that. If I pull it along Z, you can see it updating the Z curve. Now I can also go in and I can insert keys. So let's say that I wanted to change the path right about here. I can come in here and I can say modify keys, click to enter a key. That's automatically entered it into my graph, and then I can go in and I can begin to edit the shape of the curve at that point. Now I can also begin to tweak tangents. So you can see I've got a bump right here on my curve. So it actually looks okay, but I've got a little bit of a hitch right there. So what I want to do is just right click, go in and show my in and out tangents. And now I can begin to actually go in and edit the shape of that curve based on the tangents. So let's grab these tangents over here, and I'll just kind of dial those in. And now I've basically flattened out the shape of that curve at that point just by editing it in my 2D, or rather my 3D view, as opposed to my 2D view. So we've also made some nice improvements in the graph editor. And here it's a little hard to show because I'm dealing with kind of a small screen real estate because of the recording, but let's go in and we'll grab our bike here. And what you can see here is I've got kind of a series of curves that are driving my bike. I'm going to grab the translate curves, and actually if I take a look at, grabbing the wrong ones there, take a look at these translate curves, you can see that's the actual motion of the curve of the character, rather of the bike as it's floating off. So let's say I wanted to begin to scale these. I now have a tool called the region scale tool right here, which basically allows me to scale based on a bounding box. So I can essentially define a region, and it doesn't have to be an entire curve, it could be a smaller region, and I can scale out the region of that particular curve, or I can go in and I can scale out the values as well. So if I just wanted to grab a single curve and I wanted to scale that up vertically or scale it up horizontally or so on, depending on what curve it is, I can go in and I can make those simple changes from the graph editor in a much easier way now. Now a few other things to point out. Let's actually quit that tool. A few other things to point out are the new curve types, new key types rather. So right here what you'll see is a key type that is set to spline, but I'm going to go in and I'm going to set this to a new key type called auto tangent. And what that will do is it will automatically align to the incoming and outcoming curves. So let's actually pull in here a little bit better, and I'll actually convert all these to auto tangents. And you can see I get a much smoother interpolation. Now as I begin to edit these, if I get close to an incoming and outgoing curve, it will actually snap the tangents to align that, or rather snap those tangents to align to that key. So now as I come into here, notice how it flattens out as soon as I come into alignment with that. So it basically transitions between a flat tangent and then dynamically updates to more of a spline tangent, but it actually gives you even a better result from a spline tangent because it looks at the incoming and outgoing tangents of the preceding and succeeding keyframes. So it's a nice new addition as well, and again that is the new default key type. A couple of other things to point out is that we can actually filter our timeline and our graph editor now directly from our channel box. So if we go into the channel box and we turn on our sync graph editor, now I can grab a specific channel, for instance translate X or rotate Y or Z, and it'll automatically filter those curves both in the graph editor and in the timeline. So if I were to switch into sync timeline, it's going to filter those in the timeline as well. So that's a nice new change, just the ability to quickly and easily go in and isolate select directly from the channel box. So the last thing I want to talk about as far as Maya 2012 features go are the additions to Sequencer. A sequencer, for those of you that don't know, is a camera shot editing tool. What you can see here is if I scrub my Maya timeline, I basically have a camera in the viewport, and that camera is basically animated, and I'm seeing my entire scene through the timeline of that particular camera. Sequencer basically adds a layer on top of the Maya timeline. So now that you can see if I scrub on my sequencer timeline, it's actually cutting to different cameras based on what are called shots. These blue bars, or yellow when selected, are shots, and those shots represent a chunk of time along with a camera. So basically what I can do is I can basically go in and lay out a bunch of cameras, connect them into these shots so that when I play back it'll actually trigger the different cameras at the appropriate time. So one thing we've added is the ability now to view what's called a playlist. And the playlist basically gives us a kind of a spreadsheet view of all of the shots in our scene. So instead of coming down here, if I'm dealing with 20 shots, it may be a little tricky to go in and grab the actual clip. So what I can do is find the shot I'm working with, and I can find it in the list. And for instance, I can say, okay, here on my third shot, I actually want to set this, instead of from a back cam, to a facing cam. That will switch it to the alternative camera, and now when I scrub the timeline, you'll see it actually switches to that new camera. So it's very easy to use, very powerful to work with, but in the previous release rather, it was less useful to game developers because game developers typically need to get one camera out of Maya and into their game. So they essentially need to transfer all of this animation and all of these edits to a single camera. So what we've created is something called an UberCam. So I simply come in here and I say create UberCam, and what that will do is it will create a single camera based on whatever it finds in the sequencer layout here. So now I'm going to just quickly select that camera, and I'll actually go into a different point of view. Let's go to my my regular perspective camera, and we'll pull back, and you'll see that big red camera. That is actually my sequencer camera. I've scaled it up a bit. So now if I track through my timeline, you'll see that sequencer camera is following the first camera in shot 1, then it goes to shot 2, then shot 3, and then shot 4, and it begins to follow the animation of shot 4. So everything that was laid out within sequencer has now been transferred to a single camera. If I actually look through the UberCam, it's actually going to look exactly the same through my timeline. Another thing to point out is any camera specific attributes that I have associated with my camera, for instance if I change any depth of field parameters, those are also going to get stored on the UberCam. So that wraps up the webcast. I want to thank you for your time, and again, if you're interested in the kind of stuff I was showing today and talking about today, definitely check out my blog on the area where I'll be covering more related topics in kind of smaller doses. But that's it for today, and again, thank you. We'll see you next time.